Somewhere beneath the calm, sun-glittered surface of a lake you could drive past without a second glance, there is a church with no roof. A schoolhouse with no children. A street with no footsteps. And on certain days, when the water drops low enough, the past pushes back up into the light, and for a little while, the drowned world remembers how to breathe. This has happened again and again across the United States. Towns that once had names, mayors, dance halls, and Sunday mornings were erased from the map on purpose, by government order, and buried under billions of gallons of water. Not lost to earthquakes. Not lost to war. Lost to progress. And the people who lived there had almost no say in the matter. Today we're going beneath the surface, literally, to find out what happened to 4 American communities that were sacrificed to build the modern nation above them. A ghost town in the Nevada desert that keeps refusing to stay dead. For New England villages erased in a single stroke of a legislature's pen so a city could have clean water. A mountain community in North Carolina promised a road that was never built, leaving grieving families locked out of their own family graveyards. And a Georgia town with a past so dark that even 70 years later, people still whisper about what's really down there. Some of these stories are tragic. Some are unsettling. All of them are true. Let's start in the desert, at a town that has now died and come back to life more times than anyone can quite keep count of. In 1865, a small group of Mormon pioneers pushed into the far southeastern corner of what is now Nevada, near where the Muddy River meets the Colorado. They believed, at first, that they were settling in Utah territory. They built farms, a schoolhouse, a church. They called their new home St. Thomas. For a while, it thrived. The town became a stopping point on the road between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City, and by the turn of the 20th century, St. Thomas had freighters posing for photographs on its main street, a hotel grand enough to host a sitting president, and an ice cream parlor that locals still talk about generations later. But then a survey revealed an uncomfortable truth. St. Thomas wasn't in Utah after all. It was in Nevada. And Nevada wanted its taxes. The dispute grew so bitter that, according to one historian's account, St. Thomas essentially died once already, decades before the water ever came, undone by boundary lines and back taxes rather than any natural disaster. It clawed its way back. By the 1920s, St. Thomas was a real, functioning American town again, home to around 500 people. And then, in 1928, President Calvin Coolidge signed the bill that would truly seal its fate, authorization for the construction of a massive new dam on the Colorado River. We know it today as the Hoover Dam. What almost nobody in St. Thomas fully grasped, at least not right away, was that the dam wouldn't just generate electricity and tame the river. It would also create one of the largest reservoirs ever built by human hands. Lake Mead. And Lake Mead needed somewhere to go. It went straight through St. Thomas. Beginning in 1935, the waters began to rise, slowly, patiently, relentlessly. Families watched the muddy river creep further up their fences, further up their porches, further up the walls of buildings their grandparents had built. Most residents left quietly, dismantling what they could and hauling salvageable lumber away in truck beds. One man did not leave quietly at all. Hugh Lord, the last resident of St. Thomas, stayed until the water was lapping at his own front door. When he could stay no longer, he didn't drive out. He paddled. In 1938, as Hugh Lord rode away from the home he refused to abandon until the absolute last possible moment, St. Thomas disappeared beneath 60 feet of water. The schoolhouse, the ice cream parlor, the church, all of it, gone, silent, and dark. And here is where the story takes a strange turn, because St. Thomas simply would not stay buried. Throughout the rest of the 20th century, droughts periodically caused Lake Mead's water level to drop low enough for the ghost town to rise back into daylight. In 1945, it resurfaced, and former residents actually organized a reunion on the dry, dusty streets of their old hometown. It happened again in 1962, and this time St. Thomas stayed above water for 9 full years before the lake reclaimed it once more. At one particularly memorable reunion, a former Nevada state senator dug up an old felt hat he had buried near his house back in the 1930s, right before the water rose the first time, and he wore it proudly for the cameras. Then, starting in the early 2000s, a severe, prolonged drought settled over the American Southwest, and it has never fully let go. Lake Mead's water level has fallen so dramatically that St. Thomas has now been above the surface continuously for more than 2 decades, longer than at any point since the flooding began. Visitors today can walk along dusty foundation lines, past the chimney of that old ice cream parlor, which now stands as the tallest surviving structure in the entire ghost town, and past cisterns where families once drew their daily water, in grim, almost poetic irony. And it isn't only St. Thomas that the shrinking lake has given back. As Lake Mead has dropped, it has also exposed sunken boats, and, far more disturbingly, human remains, cold reminders that a reservoir this size doesn't just swallow buildings. It swallows everything that happens to be underneath it when the water comes. And St. Thomas wasn't even the first community lost to that stretch of desert. Long before Mormon pioneers arrived in 1865, the land along the muddy river had been home to the ancestral Puebloan and basketmaker peoples, who farmed maize and beans there for well over 1,000 years, in a settlement archaeologists now refer to as the Lost City. When Lake Mead rose in the 1930s, it didn't only bury a 19th-century pioneer town. It buried this much older world too, an entire span of indigenous history stretching back a millennium, sealed beneath the same 60 feet of water as St. Thomas's schoolhouse and ice cream parlor. 2 civilizations, separated by centuries, drowned by the same reservoir. St. Thomas is proof that when a lake retreats, it doesn't just reveal old wood and stone. It reveals decisions. Decisions made in Washington, decisions made by engineers, decisions that treated an entire American community as an acceptable price for a dam 300 miles downstream. And St. Thomas was far from alone. 3,000 miles away, in the hills of central Massachusetts, an entire river valley was about to meet an eerily similar fate, only this time, it wouldn't be one town. It would be 4, all at once, erased by a single vote of a state legislature. The Swift River Valley, in the heart of Massachusetts, had been home to communities for well over a century. The towns of Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott sat along the branches of the Swift River, quiet farming villages where families had lived for 4, 5, 6 generations. This land had once belonged to the Nipmuc people, who called the meeting point of the valley's waters Quabbin, meaning, roughly, the meeting of many waters. It was a name that would soon become bitterly appropriate. By the early 20th century, the city of Boston had a growing problem. Its population was exploding, and its existing water supply, drawn from a patchwork of ponds and smaller reservoirs, simply could not keep up. Engineers and state officials scoured the map for a solution, and their eyes landed on the Swift River Valley. It had the right topography, the right elevation, the right geology to hold back an enormous body of water. There was just one complication. People already lived there. Even before the flooding, these towns had already been fading for decades. Between 1850 and 1890, the Swift River Valley had lost more than a third of its population, as younger residents drifted toward the railroads and factory towns that the valley itself never quite managed to attract. There was a hat factory in Dana, and a soapstone quarry that gave a few families steady work, but mostly, this was farming country, quiet and slow, the kind of place where everybody at least recognized everybody else's face at church. State officials had actually been eyeing the valley as a potential water source since the 1890s, and in 1926 the legislature created a body called the Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission specifically to make it happen. A year later, they acted. In 1927, the Massachusetts state legislature voted to condemn the entire valley. Not persuade. Not negotiate. Condemn. It was the first time in the state's history that the legislature had ever ordered the complete disincorporation of towns, and it did it to 4 of them simultaneously. Over the following decade, more than 2,000 residents were systematically bought out and relocated. Houses were dismantled or burned. Trees were cut down by the thousands, so they wouldn't rot and foul the water once the valley flooded. Cemeteries, and there were many of them, holding generations of the valley's dead, were exhumed, and the remains were carefully moved to a brand new cemetery built specifically for this purpose, called Quabbin Park Cemetery. On the night of April 27, 1938, with less than 24 hours left before their town would legally cease to exist, the people of Enfield threw a farewell ball. More than 2,000 people came. There was a band. There was dancing. There was, by every account, an enormous amount of beer, because how else do you spend your town's very last night on earth? At the stroke of midnight, Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott were formally dissolved. They simply stopped being towns. Not abandoned. Not renamed. Legally erased. The dams, called the Windsor Dam and the Goodenough Dyke, had already been completed by 1935, and for the next 7 years, the valley slowly filled. Building by building, road by road, the last physical traces of 4 communities disappeared beneath rising water. When it was finished, in the mid-1940s, the Quabbin Reservoir held over 400 billion gallons of water, and for a time it was the largest man-made reservoir on the entire planet. Today it still quietly delivers clean drinking water to more than 3 million people across Greater Boston, most of whom have probably never once thought about where that water actually comes from, or what used to stand there before it did. If you visit the Quabbin today, you can find something called Dana Common, a grassy clearing where a whole town center used to be. The buildings are long gone, deliberately raised before the flooding, but if you look closely, you can still find the outline of the old world. Granite front steps that used to lead to a front door, standing alone in the grass, leading to nowhere at all. Stone fence posts that once marked somebody's property line, still standing guard over land that belongs to no one now. And from a place called Enfield Lookout, you can look out across the open water and know, with total certainty, that the very center of what was once the richest town in the valley lies directly beneath the surface, fully and permanently submerged, never once resurfacing the way St. Thomas has. The people of Massachusetts got clean water. The people of the Swift River Valley got a cellar hole, a stone step, and a name carved onto a plaque. Decades later, when a nearby college was being founded, its planners chose to name the residence halls after the 4 lost towns, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott House, with an administrative building called Dana House. It was a small, quiet gesture, students moving into dorm rooms named after towns most of them had never heard of, but for the families who once called those places home, it was one of the only times the outside world ever seemed to remember that Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott had existed at all. If Quabbin represents a loss handled, at least on paper, with bureaucratic order, dams built on schedule, cemeteries relocated ahead of time, our next story is something raw. Because deep in the mountains of western North Carolina, a promise was made to the people who lost their homes to a rising lake, and that promise was never kept. To this day, it sits there, unfinished, a literal road leading directly into a wall of stone. During the Second World War, the United States badly needed electricity, and fast. Aluminum production for aircraft manufacturing and top-secret nuclear research happening at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, both required massive amounts of hydroelectric power. The Tennessee Valley Authority identified the Little Tennessee River, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, as the ideal site for a new dam. Construction on Fontana Dam moved forward with wartime urgency, and it was completed in 1944. The lake it created, Fontana Lake, didn't just flood empty wilderness. It flooded an entire cluster of small Appalachian communities. Places with names like Judson, Proctor, Bushnell, Almond, Forney, and more than a dozen others simply vanished beneath the rising water. Judson alone had been home to roughly 600 people, with its own elementary school, a barber shop, a sawmill, general stores, a whole small-town life built along the banks of the river. In the space of a single project, Swain County lost a quarter of its entire population, families scattered across western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and North Georgia, chasing whatever work and housing they could find. Here is where the story turns from tragic to genuinely infuriating. As part of the deal to acquire this land, the federal government promised the displaced families something specific in return, a new 30-mile road, running along the north shore of the new lake, that would allow them to keep visiting the places where their ancestors were buried. Because it wasn't just houses being flooded. It was cemeteries. More than 30 of them, scattered across the hillsides, suddenly cut off by a lake that hadn't existed a few years earlier. Construction on that promised road began. And then it stopped. Only about 6 or 7 miles were ever completed, ending abruptly at the mouth of a long, dark tunnel bored straight into the mountainside, a tunnel that leads nowhere, because on the other side, the road that was supposed to continue simply was never built. It wasn't for lack of legal effort. Displaced families and their descendants spent years pursuing the matter through the courts, arguing that the federal government owed them the road it had promised in exchange for their land and their ancestors' graves. Locals gave the unfinished stretch a name that has stuck for decades, the Road to Nowhere. There's even a sign posted at its start, put up by the community itself, that reads, bluntly, "Welcome to the Road to Nowhere, a broken promise." For years afterward, the only way for former residents to visit their family graves was to be personally ferried across Fontana Lake by the National Park Service. That arrangement still exists today. Once a year, on what locals call Decoration Day, the Park Service shuttles former residents and their descendants across the water to the old cemeteries on the North Shore, where families share a meal, tend to overgrown graves, and, for a few hours, are allowed to stand on the ground their families once called home. If you time a visit to Fontana Lake during a severe drawdown, when engineers lower the reservoir for maintenance or power generation, you can sometimes glimpse the true scale of what's down there. Building foundations. Old roads. Even a few gravestones the relocation crews missed, quietly resurfacing after decades of silence, before the water eventually rises again and swallows them whole. In 2024, nature briefly did what the government road never could. Hurricane Helene tore through western North Carolina and dumped so much rain into the mountains that Fontana Lake's water level rose more than 20 feet in a matter of hours, a stark, sudden reminder of just how much power still sits behind that dam, and how quickly the line between the dry, remembered past and the flooded present can shift. It's a story about a broken government promise, and about grief that had nowhere to go for 70 years. But there is one more American lake with a history so troubling that it deserves to be told with real care, because underneath the surface of this particular reservoir, the story isn't only about water and engineering. It's about a community that was violently destroyed by its own neighbors, decades before a single drop of water ever touched the land. In the early 1900s, the small community of Oscarville sat along the banks of the Chattahoochee River in Forsyth County, Georgia. It was home to more than 1,000 black residents, many of them descendants of formerly enslaved people who had built, from almost nothing, a real community, churches, schools, small farms, small businesses. Then, in September of 1912, following an alleged assault of a white woman, a wave of racial terror swept through Forsyth County. 2 young black men were convicted in trials now widely regarded by historians as grossly unjust, and one of them was lynched by a mob before he could even be formally sentenced. In the weeks that followed, organized groups of armed white residents systematically drove nearly every black family out of the county, burning homes, seizing land and property, and warning residents that if they didn't leave by nightfall, they wouldn't leave alive. It became known, in the decades since, as one of the most severe and effective acts of racial expulsion in American history. Forsyth County, which had a substantial black population before 1912, had almost none left within the year. That was in 1912. The dam came almost half a century later. In the years following the Second World War, metropolitan Atlanta was growing fast, and it needed a reliable water supply, flood control, and electricity to match. The Army Corps of Engineers selected a site on the Chattahoochee River for a new dam, called Buford Dam, and the reservoir it would create, Lake Lanier, would eventually cover more than 57 square miles. Construction began in 1950, and by 1956, the lake had filled, submerging what remained of Oscarville, along with dozens of other farms, homes, and roughly 20 cemeteries whose graves had to be relocated before the water rose, though, by many accounts, not every single grave was successfully found and moved in time. The project ultimately covered more than 50,000 acres of land and displaced more than 250 families, a mix of white and black landowners, though the deepest human cost had already been paid, involuntarily, by the black families of Oscarville decades earlier, and had nothing to do with a dam that hadn't even been proposed yet. Because of that dark history, a persistent legend has grown up around Lake Lanier over the decades, the idea that the lake was somehow deliberately built to entomb a black community, and that the lake's genuinely high number of drowning deaths, several hundred since it was created, are the result of restless spirits reaching up from the flooded remains of Oscarville. It's an understandable story for people to want to tell, given everything the town's residents had already suffered. But historians who have carefully researched the record, including scholars at the Atlanta History Center, are clear that this particular claim doesn't hold up. The dam wasn't built to punish or erase Oscarville specifically. Oscarville's population had already been violently and almost completely emptied out decades earlier, in 1912, for reasons that had nothing to do with a future reservoir. The lake's tragic death toll, meanwhile, is explained by researchers less by ghost stories and more by very real, very human factors: heavy recreational boat traffic, alcohol use on the water, submerged old roadbeds and structures that can trap swimmers, and the simple fact that the lake draws millions of visitors a year. What isn't myth, what is very real and well documented, is this. Beneath the surface of Lake Lanier today sit the remnants of a town that endured a violent, racially motivated expulsion in 1912, and whatever remained of it afterward was then physically erased a second time in the 1950s, buried under water for a dam that most of Atlanta's residents have never connected to Oscarville's story at all. Two separate erasures, layered on top of one another, one act of human cruelty and one act of engineering, both converging on the same small stretch of Georgia riverbank. Divers and researchers have occasionally documented submerged foundations, roads, and remnants of a former racetrack beneath the lake's surface, quiet physical evidence that a real place with a real, painful history is still down there, whether or not the ghost stories are true. 4 lakes. 4 stories. A ghost town that refuses to stay buried in the Nevada desert. 4 proud New England villages erased by legislative decree so a distant city could turn on its taps. A mountain community in North Carolina still waiting, generations later, for a road that was promised and never delivered. And a Georgia reservoir sitting atop layers of history far darker and more complicated than most of the boaters skimming across its surface will ever know. What connects all of these places isn't just water. It's the quiet, uncomfortable truth that American progress, clean drinking water, hydroelectric power, flood control, has almost always required somebody, somewhere, to give something up, usually without much choice in the matter. Sometimes that cost was measured in cellar holes and stone fence posts in a Massachusetts meadow. Sometimes it was measured in a road that stops at a tunnel and goes no further. And sometimes, as at Lake Lanier, the true cost is layered so deep in the water and in the past that most people driving past on a Saturday afternoon, towels in the back seat, boat trailer hitched behind them, have absolutely no idea what, or who, they're floating over. The next time you're standing at the edge of a calm, quiet American lake, it's worth asking a simple question. What was here before? If you found out today that your own hometown was sitting on top of a lake like this, a place that used to be a real, living community before the water came, would you want to know the whole story, even the painful parts, or would you rather it just stayed quiet at the bottom?